Okay, we're about ready. Let me give you guys our start off here. So we've got our quiz, of course. Credit for reading. I'll try and get out of the way as quick as possible. Forgot to hit the.
It's okay. I don't need as much time today as.
Alright.
But I might even finish it.
Did I make up nicknames for you guys at one point when I handed back exams? Did I ever do that with you, or is that I started doing that after your time? Didn't I do that with you, Ariel Trotter? This guy is a gold mine. So I was thinking about Dr. Hammond.
It's called the Beak in high school.
Oh, did you have some nicknames already?
In high school, I was Beak.
Beak?
Because
your nose is quite unobtrusive, I think.
What?
Your nose is quite
It's
unobtrusive.
not about my nose. It's about the fact that on the first day of softball practice, I was a freshman, and so I was practicing with the JV team, and I was shagging balls in center field by the fence. And I threw one ball in, and I just threw the second one, figuring the coach was going to watch them come in, and he was standing at home plate. And he watched one come in, and then didn't watch the second one come in, and it bounced off home plate and hit him in the nose, and he was wearing glasses, and he had to have like facial reconstruction surgery. I mean, he dropped like a stone. It was terrifying. And so I went bawling over to the varsity field where my sister was, and I was all upset, and the coach started asking questions, and he realized that I had a major gun, and so they moved me up to varsity.
Good.
Because I broke the coach's nose.
Well, that's good.
And also everybody hated the junior varsity coach, so Mr. Hurdle. So they called me the Beak after that.
Well, I got a new one for you.
Yeah.
New nickname.
Dr. Austin?
I deserve this nickname more than you because I'm much more this way, in a bad way. Hey, can we put away our literature for a second? If you're looking at the literature at this point.
I'm trying to get my.
I was pulling it up.
Okay. Okay, because we're going to do the quiz on that, obviously. So.
You'll have a second to get
Yeah. Okay, so today our last class was Dr. Hamming Cheese.
Oh, cheese.
Yeah, but she's not as cheesy as I am. I'm cheesier, obviously. So, but I don't have that. I don't have hamming. I thought about
Hamster was another
Dr.
one.
Jeannie Body's slamming, but rhetorics of complexity and survival, maybe. I think it's a rhetoric of survival.
Absolutely. This is life and death stuff, guys.
Yeah. And maybe a rhetoric of reality in this story as well.
Ontology.
And I think a rhetoric of meaningfulness, perhaps. And I think that's where we're going next week. We'll be with Scott Davis again, sort of religion at first, sort of, and then epistemology to wind things up.
But hang on to those terms
Yeah.
so that we can think about how they relate to Llewellyn. Or Llewellyn helps us think about these questions.
Yeah. The survival one in particular, I think. But, okay, Dr. Hamming Cheese, here we go. Question number 1. That's right, but first, ready? Here we go. Cover up your answers as you go. I got a couple open-ended to begin with, because I know you really like open-ended questions. Yes, you do. Question number 1, what begins to happen to people in the story we read? What begins to happen to people? Okay, and then one more open-ended. What happens to the main character at the end? But I know you like multiple choice, so, okay, give you a couple multiple choice also. Here we go, question number 3. His daughter's name is... The story is set in a place called... Okay, that's it. Turn them over, please. Throw them on the board if you want. All right. And well, why even talk about those first two? You guys can talk about that in our discussion. Okay. His daughter's name is Esther, and the story is set in a place called Space, or yeah, Space. I was pronouncing it. Probably should be Space. Silly of me not to pronounce that. By the way, this is Hebrew for love, in case you're curious. This is Greek for utopia. Google's a great thing.
And Esther's, what's the etymology of that name? The holiday Easter. It's a biblical name, but it refers to the goddess of Easter or springtime, sort of the spring solstice. So it has meanings like rebirth or the sort of reemergence of life. Relevant, perhaps. All right, so we've got a little bit of sort of prep work to do before we get hot and heavy with our discussion. But before I have you sort of do your work, I want to just remind you, just like this is like basics of literary analysis, right? Literary interpretation. I love the idea that of thinking about literature in terms of complexity because the process of interpreting a piece of literature, a poem, or a novel, a fiction, a film, a book, has to do with it not just what the words mean in a literal sense, right? But also being able to recognize networks of associations, okay? So complexity enters in because we aren't just seeing, so we see the word Esther, and if we happen to have the knowledge or are able to Google the knowledge that Esther is a variation of Easter, and Easter means certain things in Western tradition, and then link that, right, back to a circulation of images of life or the end of life and the end of life on Earth and so on and so forth, and these notions of reemergence and emergence in the story, just the name becomes this little rabbit hole that you can go down. It becomes a repository for all of these meaningful connections. And I mean, really, this is the action of doing interpretation. And that is why it's not just, well, this is the way I see it, and because I see it this way, it's a good interpretation. That sort of anything goes version of interpreting. Well, I read this poem, and it reminds me of my puppy. No. Okay? In other words, there are righter and there are wronger interpretations. There are not single, perfectly unified, totally stable interpretations of a text because they're complex and language is always changing. And so when I joked about T.S. Eliot's influence on Shakespeare, right, with the emergence of Eliot's poetry, we can go back and reread and rethink Shakespeare in that context, right? So the context in which we read literature is always changing. Nonetheless, right, there are righter and wronger interpretations, okay? And the righter interpretations are the ones that provide evidence and can make reasonable, meaningful connections through the text and from the text to the outside world, okay? So that's why it's not an anything goes activity, okay? So when you study literature, there are things you're high school English teacher probably had you think about, right? And you identified things like theme. What's the main theme in this song, film, poem, novel? What is a theme? Just so we're all clear on that. What's a theme? What's your name?
Wesley.
Wesley, do you know what a theme is?
Really don't know how to explain it.
Okay, I'm gonna try. You can pass.
It's kind of a
You do it.
general, I really can't.
Okay, someone else want to jump in?
Like a general idea.
Okay, yeah, it's a general idea, and it's something that sort of persists throughout the text, right? And so, we often see themes of love and death and blah, 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 in literature, right? So these are the big ideas that taking all of the bits and pieces of your text sort of accumulate and form a kind of, or present a particular relationship to a big idea, right? So a theme are the big things, okay? And the themes in a theme in a text, and there's always more than one, right, are made up of smaller rhetorical tropes that we see in the text, okay? So one of them is motif. What's a motif? Anyone? You hear about motifs in decorating. Okay, what's a motif in home decor? Can you think of one? Like say,
Or
there's
liette motif.
What's that?
Is it liette motif? A liette motif?
Leitmotif?
Leitmotif or something?
Leitmotif is a very, very subtle. So a leitmotif, for instance, doesn't have, it's just sort of one single image that's repeated repeatedly. So if you, say, go into someone's home and there's a yin-yang symbol in every room, that might be a leitmotif. And so if you've ever read Catcher in the Rye, he wears this stupid red hat. And every once in a while there's a mention of his stupid red hat. And that's a leitmotif, okay? A motif is a pattern, a repetition of an image, of a word, of an idea in different ways. And so once that pattern once you see something more than once, it sort of adds up and you start thinking, well, geez, they've used that word an awful lot, or they keep, there's this, there's a motif in this story about vision and blindness and seeing and seeing things truthfully, right? So that's a motif. Now the theme, if we were to scale that up, might be a theme about ontology, right? And how we can perceive reality through the lens of reason versus the lens of emotion, okay? So you can then take the motif, see it as this larger theme, and then begin to interpret the theme, right? And then the evidence for your interpretation of the theme has to do with this reiterative imagery that you're seeing, okay? Imagery can be a motif, right? The red hat is an image that we're given in The Catcher in the Rye. But it might be, an image can be a singular thing, right? And so imagery might be the description of a landscape using particular kinds of terms that mean one thing or the other. So Edward Abbey he wrote Desert Solitaire in the 70s. He's writing about the desert, and the imagery that he uses is always hard, bloody, dangerous, violent. You're always, at risk of losing your life, and it's very much in contrast to sort of the earlier tradition in the American literature of this very green, lush, productive landscapes of the East. Okay, and so his imagery is, paints a certain kind of picture. Okay, allusion, and we can also talk about reference, which is really just direct allusion. Allusion is when the author, so usually intentionally, sometimes not, puts something in the text that reminds you or refers directly to another text outside of the story. Okay, and so there's a couple allusions in this here. For instance, there's an allusion to Gandhi, right? And the Suryat the, do you remember that text? I can't.
The Bhagavad Gita? No.
No, it's not the Bhagavad Gita, but it's another one. It's a certain practice of sort of seeing the truth as it is. And there's a reference to the opera of Philip Glass, so we can think about why she would name Philip Glass in particular. I don't have a theory on that, but so if I'm, writing a poem and I say something, to be or not to be, that's an allusion, like a direct reference to
Shakespeare? Hamlet?
Yes, good job. And so then when you get that illusion, you have to go, oh shit, well I better go read this soliloquy in Hamlet, the to be or not to be soliloquy, and what's that soliloquy about, and then how do I transport the meaning of that soliloquy and Hamlet generally back into, so you import the meaning from that text into the one that you're looking at, okay? And that's what we call intertextuality, which is another version of sort of complexity, right? That's another network of sort of the way in which texts are nested with one another. Huh? Do you know how I did that?
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. And then we always want to look for key scenes, key passages, anything that you read and you're like, oh, this seems important. Not sure why yet. You underline it, right? I hope you guys are active readers and take notes and underline things. And then finally, it's always useful to think about the characters. With Le Guin, it's pretty easy because her characters are always very figurative, right? Ike is a particular kind of dude who thinks in particular kinds of ways. And Esther is the counterpoint to that. And so is his wife and his mother. Okay, so what I want you guys to do is to look back through the story, take about 10, 15 minutes. I want you to write down any motifs, images that you see, any allusions that you might recognize in the text, okay? And allusions can be historical. They don't have to be to other literary texts. They might be to a song, a film, a historical event, an historical person, right? Can be anything like that. And then mark any key scenes or passages so that when we're talking about the story and trying to unravel it, you can bring those up as evidence for a particular point in the moment. No, I'm going to use it. We can continue to interpret yeah, because there's some stuff that nobody's written anything about and never will. Right. hopefully they'll just have that experience.
Yes.
It has something to do with aesthetics too, right?
Yeah.
So you keep going back to something, and if it's complex, in the way Dickinson's poems, it seems really simple, but it's complex, and you keep coming back to it.
Good. Good. That's cool.
Well, they do different things though too. You know, so what, you know, this is the question behind that, right? The novel genre, engages in certain kinds of complexity. I can engage certain techniques through direct discourse and dialectic, this sort of dialectic imagination, stuff, which you can do in a novel, but you can't do very much because you generally don't write in nonsense. So, but you when you're looking at a novel at Dickens or Dostoevsky compared to a novel, you're gonna get more complexity. But there's also, for example, like Edward Jones' Invitation to Rapture, which is two line poems, is the title of the poem. And it's like,
That's very cool.
yeah. My favorite Leon Leeds collection of poems called The City in Which I Live Here. Just the grammar of it is so ridiculous. And it connects with the fact that he's a English speaker, so his syntax is correct, but not conventional by standards. But it's revision syntax. But Leon, his staff is our Mhm. Really? What time on Friday? Those are happy ones. I'd go with my lucky day. Okay. How's it going? You got some stuff? Ish?
I was making the quiz today, going back through it, and I got a quote, can't wait to use.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, and you're welcome to throw some things up here too. What are some of the images that you see or motifs? Just give me some stuff.
Reason versus sin is believing.
Okay, reason versus maybe empiricism. Empiricism is, you know, to see something, right? I'll only believe it in, you know, if I see it. If we can, it's not just about sort of extrapolating something as true, but seeing it.
One of the lines I've done where is towards the end, where they were arguing about the fact that she called him crazy, but I don't remember who she was, for the fact that he's the only one that's not seeing it. And he was saying the fact that I'm not seeing it is what determines that you are crazy. I don't remember the argument.
Right, and so they're taking these sort of situated perspectives,
Yeah.
right? And he's sort of claiming a hierarchy, right? Because I am Mr. Rationality and I'm Mr. Science, then my not seeing is proof that it's a hallucination. And she sort of undermines that by saying, but what if, you know, you're not seeing it because you're crazy, and our seeing it is evidence that it's real, right? And so it right away calls into question how we perceive reality, how we know what the world is around us, right? Have you guys come across the term epistemology? You have? You know that word?
Yeah, I don't remember what it means.
You don't remember what it means? Okay, so epistemology is simply the sort of the study of how we know what we know. Okay, so we can be very certain about our, be absolutely positive about something, and then that gets undermined by a new scientific discovery, or somebody argues a different perspective, and you sort of have this sort of epiphany, right? Ontology is the same basic idea, except for it's not just about what we know, it's about how, the sort of essence of the truth of reality around us, right? And so people talk about having an ontological crisis. I absolutely I had an ontological crisis when I was 19, and I watched a rated R movie that had some like gay stuff in it, and I thought, oh, holy mother of God, I'm gay.
Uh-huh.
I mean, and it happened
Right.
like that, because I was absolutely certain, 100% positive that and I had this huge ontological crisis, right?
Mhm.
And how could you not know something about that about yourself? So it wasn't just a crisis in what I knew, but it was a crisis of how I knew myself. And so when he can't see it, he's having an epistemological crisis, to the point of it being an ontological crisis, because his lack of being able to see it makes him question his own sense of self, right? And think about self, think about identity as simply a position, as a position from which you experience the world, right? So it's not just that he begins to question his ability to see things correctly. He begins to question himself as one who sees, or in this case doesn't see, right? So where else do we see this motif of seeing, not seeing, vision, perception? Are there other examples from the text?
There's lots of hallucinations.
They talk about glasses and how they're like strong. They said that a couple times.
Yeah.
Just these down on glasses and she can't see.
Right, so Esther is blind, right? And she has, we're told, a developmental blindness, and she's helically perfect. In other words, from a genetic standpoint, she's perfect, but she can't see because, allergies and exposure to different things on Earth, right? Is this meant to be ironic in the story? What do we do with Esther's blindness, particularly in relation to this other point that Harash made about Ike and his ability to see or not see the ghosts on the ship?
The water transfer.
Mm-hmm. Which she doesn't want, right? And it ends up leaving her more blind. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the contaminants
Mm-hmm.
of Earth
Mm-hmm.
are what made her blind,
Mm-hmm.
and yet, is she the first to see, or one of the first to see?
She's not the first to see, but she doesn't have the same
Problems.
resistance to it
Right.
that Ike does. She's
And
like, okay, cool.
And that seems to sort of be the opposite of what's happening with Ike.
Mhm.
And Ike is well contaminated or influenced or shaped by Earth
Mhm.
and the technologies of seeing
Mhm.
and knowing,
Mhm.
and that. is
Right,
what
but
keep-
he
is
sort of, but
keeping
he
him
has
from-
this, he sort of lives in along, according to this fantasy, where he doesn't have to, we can just disconnect from Earth, right? Which he calls their sort of tether, their visual tether, right? They have this screen where they can look down on Earth and see it, and they get these news feeds, which is another kind of seeing. And he even says that he wished that the young people could see Earth as it is. And it's an interesting moment in the story, because what he means, of course, is that they would see it as he sees it. But as the story develops, we get that he's not seeing it as it really is. He's seeing it according to a particular epistemological framework, which is reason, rationality, science, right? Remember, he's a physicist. He's a scientist in that sort of, that science fictional mad scientist sort of way, right? But his madness is the fact that he's absolutely 100% by his standards sane, right? And so vision then gets scaled up in the story, not just to be about what you actually see with your orifices, but how you see in a more sort of figurative sense, your perception and your perspective, right? And so we see, and then in the story, this sort of counterpoint between Ike and Esther, where Le Guin very cleverly flips it around, right? He's the one who can quote unquote see, but is blind, right? She's the one who is blind, but sees things in a much more situated, realistic way, right? So what is wrong, according to Le Guin, not necessarily you don't have to agree with her, what is wrong with Ike's perspective? Well, let's start with what is Ike's perspective? How would we describe his point of view?
By the end of it, he was almost going out of his way to not think about what was going on.
Okay, so there's a sort of stubbornness,
Yeah.
maybe a denial.
Because when he was like walking through something, walking towards a crowd or someone yells, "Watch out for whatever, watch out for," and he just said, "I'm just gonna ignore it."
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, even just ignoring it, it was strange and wow. Not even acknowledging that they said that.
Mm-hmm. So why is he so stubborn? Why is he sort of being so willful and just refusing to even admit that, not that he might see something, but that other people are seeing it and that it might be real? Why is he so determined not to see the ghosts? What's he afraid of?
Not me.
Hmm? So not being right is part of it, right? He wants to feel like his point of view, his way of seeing the world is the right way of seeing the world. Okay. What else maybe is he afraid of?
Well, his machines, his technology,
Mhm.
right? He's afraid, isn't he, that if he's not seeing something that everybody else is seeing, and he's sort of a reflection of the machines. He knows the machines very well. He knows them better than anybody and all that stuff.
He's an environmental engineer. That's what he does on the ship. He engineers their environment.
And so but it could mean that he can't see something because his machines can't see something. And if his machines can't see something, then that's really bad.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing has been built on
faith that the machines will...
Yeah, the logic and rationality of science and the way science proceeds and everything. And so they've built this whole artificial world out there floating in space and based on all of this. And if there's something completely unanticipated that's, quite real for these other people, but it's completely unanticipated from those formulas that made the space station or whatever, in space. That is bad news. That is really bad news. And so you are you're clinging, I would think.
Why is it bad news?
Because it means that, sensitivity to initial conditions, you have overlooked something really big.
Mm-hmm.
And like he's the father of this immediate family, but in a sense like he's supposed to be not in control, but like protecting everyone else also. So if he does mess something up, for whether or not it's bad, in his sense he let everyone down and that's a big stress on him. I feel like that's how I would.
Right. And so his name is interesting in this way because his name is Isaac, right? Which is a double illusion, right? Can somebody give me one of them? Newton, Isaac Newton, obviously from the title. And Isaac Newton is sort of considered one of the grandfathers of modern science. He's part of the Enlightenment, right? and the scientific method. He was also obsessed with the function of light. So his magnus opus, his biggest, most scientific document is called Optics. Right, so it's about how we see. And so that's one. And the other one, what's another Isaac that you can think of? The Bible, right. So he's this Old Testament patriarch, right? And I think this is an interesting point when you say that he's a father in the text, but he's also sort of the father, right? He's the patriarch of this group. And we can go even further. This is why I love words. So patriarch has the same etymology as words like pattern. Okay? So padre in Spanish, right? Pater, right? And this is seen as, I'm going to run out of space here. I lied, I said I was going to not write on this one. That's right. So pattern, patriarch have the opposite, which is matriarch, right? Matter, right? Mother, and also matrix. And the idea that is that the material matter, the stuff of earth, right? Mother Earth, right? Is disorderly, it's chaotic, and it's only through the father of order, right? So it's the patriarch who brings order, creates a pattern, right? So even think about the Genesis in the Old Testament. Earth is sort of there. It's just sort of this squishy, nooky, disorderly blob until God says, let there be light, let there be animals, let there be order, right? And in fact, if you read Genesis, there are two different creation stories. One where everything is sort of warm and squishy and wet, and one where everything is dry. And if you look at the history of the Hebrew Bible, you can see a combination of different pre-Hebrew creation stories, right? And so you get already this dichotomy going on in this story between Ike the father, and then but also the spaceship as being this sort of epitome of order, of created patterns, this perfectly functioning system, but disconnected from the matrix of Earth, okay? And in fact, there's a point he says, I wish we could just cut off our connection. He says, I hate to look down. And he even describes their connection to Earth as an umbilicus. So there is this sort of motif then in the story of motherhood, right, of parenting, and it seems then to connect back to the sort of ecological theme in the story, right? Make sense?
Makes sense. I wish I saw that when I first read it, but makes perfect sense now.
Yeah, it's fun, isn't it? Any other references to mothers or fathers in the story? Do you remember Ike's mother? Right? So she's left on Earth, right? And she's one of my epigraphs that I put up there for you. She says, let me breathe smog, okay? She doesn't want to be in the spaceship. She doesn't want to be in the little ball bearing floating up there in space. She wants to be on Earth and connected, right? And so there's a way in which she also, like Esther, represents the inverse, or serves as the word we use in literary studies is a counterpoint. She serves as the sort of counterpoint to Ike's desire to escape the meaningless clutter, he calls it, the meaningless clutter of Earth, and to live in this bounded, perfect, linear, simplified, controllable space, versus Esther, who has this open, vulnerable connection, right? And she can't see, so she has to feel and touch and find her way around in a much more immediate, visceral, connected sort of way. And the mother doesn't want to be, enclosed or bounded in the way that Ike does. She wants to breathe small. She'd rather live in the meaningless clutter of Earth and even die in it than to be cut off from it, right? And so she's much more matrix-like than. I feel like the word matrix was ruined by that.
I know, because it's so ordered. Well, matrix is orderly. It's a grid.
Well, it is well, it's interesting. In the matrix, it's simply a medium. The idea of
yeah.
a matrix is a medium in which we exist. And
I mean, how is it anything other than what I'm thinking, a three-dimensional computer grid or whatever that you enter into? And I mean, you're thinking it's more disorderly, and right?
well, the origin of the term has to do with its connection to notions of matter, and so it's the sort of opposite of pattern in that
Okay.
sense.
It's the stuff.
But it's interesting to think about the matrix as a sort of backwards illusion, and they're playing with the same imagery here. Have you guys seen the Matrix?
Of course.
So when he wakes up from the Matrix and he gets like, then they show it from the machine side, and he's basically a little battery that's in this kind of floating in this squishy amniotic fluid, and then he's ejected, and it's a double image of birth, right? He's being shot down the birth canal and sort of born, but it's also the image of, you know, he's shit or abject being flushed down the toilet. It's both of those things. He's being expelled. And so the idea is that he leaves the matrix, he's born, and then he wakes up in the desert of the real, right? So he's born into quote unquote real reality.
Mm-hmm.
Which is really stupid because they end up right back in another matrix, right? The one that we all live in, the one where the gay people and the black characters get killed first, and the good-looking young white guy is the hero because he gets snooky with a hot chick. If that isn't a matrix, I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm.
So you never wake up, is what I'm saying. But you should keep trying.
So just by the way, guys, just so you're tracking this and stuff, this is a good way of our being able to show how you do. What did you say? This is literary analysis that we're doing?
Interpretation.
Literary interpretation. How you do that to show the meaningfulness of a piece of art, a cultural product, a cultural expression. It becomes more and more meaningful as you talk about it and as other people talk about it, as you think about it.
Well, and it should get messier. And your goal in some ways is to, and this is what my dissertation director used to say, is your goal is to complexify. Your goal is not to come up with one single perfect reading, because there isn't such a thing. It's to make it complicated.
Well, but not
making,
chaotic.
Not chaotic.
Not chaotic. Not
but
disorderly.
one that takes into account more than what is
Yeah,
there.
but really, really rich, and a lot of ingredients and cooking times and everything go into that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chemical reactions.
Yeah. So you should be able to, maybe for your final exam, you know, you might be asked to talk about how does a literary analysis show that something's complex, and how does it make something complex, and show that with Newton's sleep, you know. Now I drew something up on there that no, that's okay. I'll bet they saw that anyway. That there were. I was just struck by how Dr. Hamming put theme up there, and then motif, something that's repeated. Well, that sounds a lot like frequency. When we talked earlier in the course about things that happen a lot become more meaningful to you. And then imagery, well, that's sort of maybe just a really thoroughly described, I'm reading a novel right now where there's this one street that everybody lives along, and they describe the street really well. And that's sort of that image, and they keep coming back to that image, they use that image. That could be stability, that could be a stable thing that you can keep coming back to. And then allusion, no question that's connections, right? You're making a lot of connections to other things. So that's impact, the impact of something. So I just want to point out that this happens a lot, and I got it from statistics on the one hand, but also from looking at art and how art is interpreted.
Well, and it goes back to I was talking about Karen Barad as this theoretical physicist who sort of suggests that all science and all meaning making which includes science, happens in situ, where everything is sort of interrelated and intra-connected and interacting, and so that we can't have data, we have relata. And so if you think about texts, words, sentences as being relata, then you have a very easy process, or a pretty straightforward process of interpreting a text, because you think, okay, this illusion, this image, this quote, this passage, this character exists in relation to something, right? Because the thing is, if characters in literature didn't resonate with us, they didn't reflect the way we feel sometimes, or someone we know, or an experience that we've had, or an idea that's circulating in our culture, if literature didn't work that way, it would not have meaning at all, right? It's in its connection to our lived experiences that makes literature meaningful. Sometimes that's why it's harder for us to understand older works of literature, because we don't necessarily feel the same way, people in Beowulf's time felt. And so we don't have the same notions of privacy that they had.
And it's why new works of literature are important. Because as our environment shifts, right? I did not grow up with BuzzFeed and stuff like that. And so there's no novels that I read, and there's no novels that John Updike wrote and stuff like that have that in there. And so you guys need to write them, So.
Truth. Yeah. Okay, other motifs, themes, things you saw? Stuff you want explained? Someone who hasn't offered anything? Yeah.
So one thing when Ike was describing Earth, he talked about all they had on Earth was the 4 horsemen, which is like basically the apocalypse. And so that was cool because it really gave me like a reference of what Earth was like.
But isn't it odd that Ike, who is supposed to be this, the epitome of scientific rationality and reason, would have this kind of religious experience or express his feelings in the context of religion? I mean, he's super anti-emotion, and yet he has this moment of kind of religious hope. Does that strike you as weird?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get to finish the reading, but I thought it was weird from what I had read about him that he used a biblical reference to talk about Earth.
And he's using that at what point? When is he using that? Is that to explain leaving Earth?
He's like reminiscing with his wife about like he's glad they left.
Yeah.
And he's talking about how horrible it was there.
It's to rationalize.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking about a lot of stuff, and you all know that the violence that's happening in this world right now, the horrible, horrible, horrible violence that's happening in this world right now, and religion is often a justification for it or whatever. I mean, so
well,
he's
any kind of fundamentalism
is what?
Whether is a justification for it.
It's often, yeah. It's often a nice, clean, and black and white sort of thing that can propel you forward. And so I'm just thinking, it's funny, you'd use religion. I mean, you just left your Mother Earth, okay?
And you left your
you
Mother
damn well
Earth.
better be religious about that. Right? And it's when people are, they're slaughtering innocent people, the stuff that they're doing out there is horrible, right? And there's religion behind it often.
But here's another twist, Ike is Jewish. So he shouldn't necessarily be evoking the book of Revelations, which is the New Testament text. And so his religion is not necessarily a personal one.
No.
And
right.
one of the other examples of his quote-unquote blindness in the text is when he's shocked to find out that there's anti-Semitic words being flung around, and that some of the other of his colleagues have anti-Semitic sentiment, which he misses completely, right? And I love Esther's reaction when he's like, "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" And she says, "Oh shit, Daddy." Right? Which is great. It's such a great, like, are you that stupid? But also, shit evokes a sense in which, it's messy. Life is messy. People are messy, and you don't get to have this sort of perfect rational utopia. There's going to be shit.
How many of you were at the job talk yesterday? Only Liz? Michelle was there too, right? Well, remember that when he talks about women and men? Remember that? That was sort of unforgettable, especially from a sociological point of view. So this guy is speaking. It's his job talk. He's being brought in. He's a psychologist, and women surgeons versus male surgeons. Women surgeons are more likely to request and want ethical training, right? And he said, why would that be? You remember what he said? What did he say about that?
I think it's because he said women were trying to not overpower, but like since men are considered like the dominant, and women were trying to like impress them by saying like they know just as much, so they would try and.
That was the confidence.
She mentioned like how men tended to see the world more like black and white, whereas women like made things more disorderly and saw things sort of as like gray.
Yes.
And like saw
They live in the
different
gray.
like areas
That's right.
of right and wrong.
And is it very much like that matter matriarch thing that Hamming is just talking about here?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, so your first passage up there is from Evelyn Fox Keller, who wrote a really important piece called Gender in Science. And she's looking not at how men are better at science than women or anything like that. She's looking at the way the language in the sciences is gendered. That we have the hard sciences, chemistry, physics, and then the soft sciences, right, which are more open to women. And that embedded in the language or scientific discourse itself is this sort of sense of gender. And Bruno Latour, and if you want, I'll do a little show and tell here and kind of try to pull all this together, talks about the origins of this. And of course, the scientists of our scientific revolution were men. Women simply weren't allowed to practice science then, but we've retained this sort of gendered history by imagining both a sort of that science is a masculinist standpoint, that it's reason versus emotion. I mean, you think of all the stereotypes that we have about men versus women. It's reason versus emotion. It's rational, right? And remember how Ike, when he talks about he says the women and the children are sentimental and emotional and homesick, right? Homesick, as in back to this notion of matrix, right? And if they could only see reason. And so he even puts that in gendered terms in the story. But there's this whole history of that.
Yeah, and that's part of the, going back to Barad's point, right, that everything is in situ, everything is in relata. And so we talk about everything in terms of gender, often.
But in a way, that in and of itself is an impulse to sort, to separate, to purify different modes of thinking as being female or male, masculine,
Right.
feminine, and so on and so
Right.
forth. Right.
And clean and dirty, by the way. And so you mentioned that, she says
mind,
shit,
body,
daddy,
all
yeah.
that stuff, right?
And this guy said last night, yesterday, during his talk, it was almost a misstep, sort of a Freudian or potentially Freudian, not Freudian, but politically incorrect thing to say, but he just said it. Do you remember what he said? He said, well, that's just the way men and women are. I mean, women tend to think in this gray area, and men tend to think in black and white, and women are just, women like to get all messy, and women like to get dirty, and men like to, like that. But
Essentialism much?
Right,
Yeah,
I
we're
know.
trying to get away from that.
Yeah.
That sort of way.
Yeah, right. But he doesn't. He's
Right.
in natural science and more.
So what I love about this quote from Keller, the recognition of the independent reality of both self and other is a necessary precondition for both for science and for love. So she's already going to make it nicely later. It may not, however, be sufficient for either. Certainly the capacity for love, for empathy, for artistic creativity requires more than a simple dichotomy between subject and object. I'll explain why she's talking about that. Autonomy too sharply defined, think about Ike. That's what he wants. He wants autonomy. He wants disconnection. He wants to be separate from the messy clutter, right? The meaningless clutter of Earth. Reality too rigidly defined cannot encompass the emotional and creative experiences which give life its fullest and richest depth. And I love this, especially in the context of this course, because I know that Dr. Demarath has been talking about novelty, new experiences, new connections, aesthetics in relation to complexity. And that's in some ways what she's talking about, that science has to be embedded within, situated within, not just, hard, rigid scientific models of how the world works, but it also has to incorporate one's point of view. It has to incorporate the creative and the emotional, right, in order to give a more realistic representation of the world as it actually is, not as we want it to be. And so Donna Haraway, who's a really important philosopher of science, offers a different perspective. She says this world must always be articulated from people's point of view through situated knowledges. Notice the multiple, not just a knowledge, not just a version of the world, but multiple versions of reality. These knowledges are friendly to science, but do not provide any grounds for history escaping inversions and amnesia. So think about the ghosts as them being cured from their amnesia, right? They have tried to forget the earth, to forget their origins, to forget the matrix from which they have been given life. And it's not that the ghosts are haunting them from nowhere, they're haunting them from somewhere, right? From their own history. About how articulations get made about their political semiotics, if you will. I think the world is precisely what gets lost in doctrines of representation and scientific objectivity. So it's really important as we talk about this not to misunderstand me as being anti-science, or any of these folks as being anti-science. How do I make this work? Because of course they're not. And so just by way of a little bit of history, one of the things, especially in the title of the story, Le Guin is talking about the scientific method, right? She's talking about Bacon's empiricism, which is the methodology that guided Newton and his contemporaries and continues to guide modern science. And if you look on the internet about what the scientific method is, you will come across this particular definition over and over again. That it's an approach to science that seeks to let reality speak for itself. In this articulation of science, then, the scientist is a mediator. He objectively translates nature and what the nature would say about itself. But the critique that I think that Haraway, as well as Keller, Latour, and then finally Le Guin are offering is that this particular hyper-objective, hyper-rational point of view, right, where the scientist mediates but is in no way influencing the translation of nature into language, into discourse. It doesn't acknowledge the situatedness of that mediation, which of course is inevitably human, therefore limited. You cannot see all of the